Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'd been planning this camping trip for months. Looking back now, I realize how stupid that sounds. Planning your own nightmare. But after the year I'd had, grinding through 80-hour weeks at a software job that was slowly killing me, I just needed to get away. Needed silence. Needed trees instead of cubicles. I found the group on a hiking forum. Just a post from some guy named Marcus saying he was putting together a backcountry trip into the remote sections near Cades Cove in the Smokies. 4 days. Deep wilderness. No crowds. I didn't know any of these people. Marcus, who claimed he knew the area. Sarah, this grad student who wouldn't shut up about environmental science. And Tom, middle-aged guy from Tennessee who barely said 2 words during our initial email exchanges. We met at the Cades Cove parking area on a Thursday in late October. The tourist season was over. The place felt empty in a way that should have been peaceful, but somehow wasn't. Marcus took the lead immediately, consulting his GPS and checking this worn topographic map like he actually knew what he was doing. We followed an old settler's path for the first few hours, past crumbling stone walls and forgotten graves, the kind of stuff that reminds you people lived and died out here long before any of us showed up. Then we left the maintained trail. Marcus said he knew a spot, said we'd be 8 miles from the nearest marked trail, 15 from any road. Nobody will bother us there, he said, like that was supposed to be reassuring. The trees got thicker, the canopy blocked out the sun, and I started noticing how quiet everything was. No birds, no squirrels, just our boots on dead leaves and this oppressive silence that felt wrong. We reached the campsite just before dark, this clearing beside a creek, surrounded by steep ridges covered in laurel thickets so dense you couldn't see more than a few feet into them. We set up camp in a circle, made a fire, ate freeze-dried meals, and tried to pretend everything was normal. Around 10 that night, we heard it, a wailing cry from up on the ridge, long and echoing through the hollow in a way that made my skin crawl. Sarah laughed nervously. "Coyote," she said, but I saw Marcus's hand move to the knife on his belt. And Tom just stared into the darkness with his eyes narrowed like he recognized something. The sound came again, closer this time. It sounded like a woman screaming, but not quite. There was something off about it. Something that my brain couldn't process as entirely human. We eventually went to our tents, but I barely slept. Just laid there listening to the silence, which somehow felt worse than the screaming. Sarah's voice woke me up. Panic in her tone. Tom was gone. His tent was open, sleeping bag half unzipped, but no sign of him anywhere. We searched for hours, calling his name until our voices gave out. Marcus tried his GPS, but it wouldn't get a signal. Same device that had worked perfectly the day before. Sarah's compass started spinning, unable to find north. We decided I'd hike out for help while Marcus and Sarah kept searching. I followed our route from the day before. At least I thought I did. But nothing looked right. The logging road branched in places I didn't remember. Landmarks I'd noted coming in had vanished. My compass was as useless as Sarah's. I walked for hours, choosing paths that looked most traveled, but the forest kept getting stranger. I started seeing symbols carved into trees. Not trail markers, but crude patterns that looked ancient. Circles within circles. Angular shapes that hurt to look at, and everywhere, that same oppressive silence. It was late afternoon when I found the homestead. It appeared suddenly through the trees, a cluster of rotting log structures collapsing in on themselves. This wasn't one of the preserved historic sites. This was something else. something forgotten. The main house still had most of its roof. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, the air smelled like rot and something else. Something that reminded me of a butcher shop. There were bones scattered across the floor. Too many bones. Too many different sizes. Strips of cloth that might have once been clothing, and on the walls, those symbols again, carved deep into the logs. I backed out slowly, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. That's when I saw Tom, or what was left of him, hanging from a tree at the edge of the clearing, suspended by old rope. Swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. He'd been dead for hours, maybe days, which was impossible because he'd disappeared that morning. But there was no denying what I was seeing. I ran, crashed through the forest with branches tearing at my face and roots trying to trip me, but I kept moving until I burst out onto a paved road and nearly got hit by a park ranger's vehicle. The next hours were a blur. Search and rescue mobilized. I tried to explain, tried to lead them back. They found our campsite, found our gear, Marcus and Sarah's tents empty, but they never found the homestead I described. Never found the body hanging from the tree. Never found any of it. They searched for 3 days and found nothing. Marcus and Sarah were never found. Tom's remains turned up 6 months later, miles from where we'd camped. The autopsy said he'd been dead for several days. Cause of death? Exposure. Though the medical examiner noted unusual marks on the body that couldn't be explained. I left the mountains that day and never went back. Sold all my camping gear. Deleted every hiking app on my phone. But sometimes, right before I fall asleep, I can still hear that wailing cry echoing through the darkness. And I know, I absolutely know, that there are things in those old mountains that don't want to be found. Things that have been there longer than any park or any people. Things that still hunger in the forgotten hollows where the maps lie and the compasses spin uselessly. Where the silence itself is a warning that few are wise enough to heed. I wasn't in the best place when I took the job. That's the only explanation I have for why I said yes to something so obviously wrong. My 5-year relationship had just imploded. The person I thought I'd marry had left, and somehow I ended up being the bad guy in everyone's story. Lost the apartment, lost most of my friends. Ended up back in my childhood bedroom at 29, staring at glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. Then I lost my job. So when I saw the listing for a live-in caretaker position at a remote mountain property, I barely read the details before applying. Room and board included. Decent pay. Light duties maintaining an estate. It seemed like exactly what I needed. A place to disappear. The interview was over the phone with a man named Earl Hutchkins. Thick mountain accent. Gravelly voice that suggested decades of smoking. He explained that the property had been in his family for generations. Big estate built by his grandfather in the 1920s, deep in the mountains near Panther Creek in eastern Kentucky. An hour from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable in bad weather. He needed someone to live there full-time, keep the place clean, make sure the pipes didn't freeze, handle basic maintenance. I accepted without ever seeing the place. Earl wired me the first month's pay as an advance. Told me to meet him at a gas station off Route 60, and he'd lead me to the property. I packed everything I owned into my dying sedan and made the drive. Earl was waiting when I arrived. Tall man in his early 70s with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His handshake was almost painfully firm. The drive took an hour and a half. Paved road gave way to gravel, then gravel gave way to dirt. The forest grew thicker on both sides, blocking out most of the sunlight. No houses, no signs of civilization, just endless trees and the occasional glimpse of a ridgeline. The house appeared suddenly through the trees, this massive 3-story structure built of dark stone and weathered wood. Steep gables and narrow windows, surrounded by overgrown gardens and outbuildings in various stages of decay. It looked abandoned, haunted, but I needed the job too badly to say anything. Earl showed me around. Most rooms were empty or filled with furniture covered in dust sheets. The kitchen was functional but outdated. Wood-burning stove, refrigerator that hummed too loudly. My quarters were on the second floor. Actually, pretty comfortable once Earl showed me how to work the temperamental heating system. Then he gave me the rules. Don't go into the basement under any circumstances. That area was locked and off-limits. He had personal items stored down there. Don't invite anyone to the property. He valued his privacy. Don't leave without informing him first. Cell service didn't exist out here, but there was a landline in the kitchen. I agreed to everything, too desperate to question anything. Earl left as darkness fell, and I found myself alone in this enormous house that creaked and groaned like it was alive. The first few weeks passed uneventfully enough. I established a routine, cleaning during the day, reading by firelight at night. Earl visited twice, bringing supplies, checking on my work. He seemed satisfied, though I noticed he was always watching me, his sharp eyes following my movements in a way that made my skin crawl. I discovered the locked door to the basement by accident, heavy wooden door behind the kitchen with a modern deadbolt and padlock. I tried the handle once, just curious. It was firmly secured. I found myself thinking about what might be down there, my imagination running wild in those long, quiet evenings. In the 6th week, things changed. Earl's visits became more frequent. His demeanor shifted. He started asking personal questions, wanting to know about my past, my failed relationship, my family. I answered vaguely, uncomfortable with where the conversations were heading. He began staying longer, sometimes arriving in the evening and not leaving until the next morning. He'd sit in the kitchen, drinking coffee, watching me work. His gaze felt predatory. I started noticing other things. Drawers in my room that I'd left closed would be open. Items moved. My clothes seemed to have been touched, rearranged. I confronted Earl about it. He denied everything calmly, suggesting the isolation was getting to me. He said it with concern in his voice. But there was something else there too. Amusement, like he enjoyed watching me doubt myself. The landline died one evening. No dial tone, nothing. I checked the connections, but everything seemed fine. When Earl arrived 2 days later, I told him. He said he'd look into it. Weeks passed. The phone stayed dead. I was completely cut off now. No way to communicate with the outside world unless I drove to town. But Earl's warning about leaving the property echoed in my mind. I began to suspect cameras, the way he'd reference things that happened when he wasn't there. Small details he shouldn't have known. I searched, but found nothing. I started getting dressed in my bathroom. Keeping my door locked at night, though I knew the old locks wouldn't stop anyone. Winter arrived early, snow falling in October and not stopping. The dirt road became impassable. Earl stopped coming. I was trapped, supplies running low, fear eating at me. The noises in the house grew worse, sounds from the basement that couldn't be explained. Scratching, tapping, sometimes what sounded like muffled voices. I made my decision on a night in early November when I woke to find my bedroom door standing open. I'd locked it before bed. I was certain. I packed a bag in the darkness and left through the kitchen door. My car wouldn't start. Battery dead from the cold. So I walked. Through knee-deep snow, following the road down the mountain in the dark, wearing every layer I owned. I walked for 6 hours, slipping and falling countless times, until I reached the paved road as dawn broke. An elderly couple stopped for me, drove me to the sheriff's office. I told them everything. They listened with expressions that shifted from concern to skepticism, but they drove up to the property later that day. The house stood empty. Earl's truck wasn't there. They broke the lock on the basement door. What they found confirmed every fear I'd had. A room set up like a cell, cot and bucket, chains bolted to the wall, cameras positioned throughout the house, feeding to monitors in the basement. Dozens of photographs of women, surveillance-style images of them sleeping, showering, unaware, and a filing cabinet full of folders, each labeled with a woman's name and dates of employment. Caretakers going back decades. The investigation revealed that most of the women had simply disappeared. No bodies were ever found, though the search went on for weeks. Earl Hutchkins himself vanished, his truck found abandoned near the Tennessee border. He was never located. I learned later that I was the only caretaker in 30 years who had managed to leave that property alive, the only one who had trusted her instincts enough to run before it was too late. The authorities believe the other women are buried somewhere in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding the estate, their graves hidden in the dense Appalachian forest, where they'll likely never be found. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or comment really helps keep them alive. I moved back to eastern Kentucky to help take care of my grandmother. There was no one else, and she'd refused to leave the house where she'd lived for nearly 20 years since my grandfather passed. But a fall and a broken hip changed everything. The house was located at the end of Blood Hollow Road, a winding mountain route that stretched for almost 15 miles from the nearest town of Hazard. The road had earned its name, according to local legend, from a massacre during the Civil War, though some claimed it was named for the iron-rich clay that ran red when it rained. Either way, it was an ominous name for an isolated stretch of pavement. I made the drive 3 times a week for the first month, commuting from a small apartment I'd rented in Hazard while sorting out care arrangements. The road was unsettling even in daylight. Winding through dense forest with steep drop-offs on one side and sheer rock faces on the other. No houses for miles, no cell service. In several places, the canopy was so thick it felt like driving through a tunnel. It was on a Tuesday evening in early October when my car broke down. I'd stayed later than usual at my grandmother's house, helping sort through boxes in the attic. I didn't leave until after dark. I was about 7 miles from town when the engine began to sputter. I'd been meaning to get the car serviced. Had noticed it running rough, but I'd put it off because of everything else. Now I was paying for that procrastination. The engine died completely. I coasted to a stop on a particularly isolated stretch, pulling as far onto the narrow shoulder as I dared. I tried to restart it 3 times. No luck. My cell phone had no signal, as expected. I sat in the darkness, weighing my options, almost 9 at night. I could walk back to my grandmother's, about 8 miles uphill, or walk toward town, 7 miles through darkness, or stay with the car and hope someone drove past. I decided to give it an hour. I locked my doors, turned on my hazard lights, and waited. The forest pressed in on all sides, a wall of darkness beyond the weak glow of my hazards. After about 45 minutes, I saw headlights approaching from town. Relief flooded through me. It was a pickup truck, old and rusted, moving slowly. It pulled up behind my car and stopped. A man got out, tall and thin, overalls and a baseball cap. He approached with a friendly smile, asking what seemed to be the problem. I explained about my car, thanked him for stopping. Asked if he had cell service or could give me a lift to town. Something in his manner set off alarm bells. The way he stood too close, the way his eyes kept moving over me, the way he seemed too eager, too helpful. He said he didn't have a phone, that he lived up the road and didn't bother with technology. but he'd be happy to give me a ride. Or he could look at my engine if I liked. I thanked him but declined, told him a tow truck was already on the way, that I'd been able to call before my phone died. A lie, but my instincts were screaming. The man's smile faded slightly. He asked if I was sure. Said it was no trouble. I insisted, backing toward my car. He stood there watching me, not moving. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Finally, he shrugged and turned back to his truck. But instead of leaving, he just sat there. Engine running, headlights illuminating my car. I got back in my vehicle and locked the doors, my heart pounding. Through my rearview mirror, I could see him sitting in his truck, just watching. Minutes passed. He didn't leave. I tried starting my car again, desperately, and miraculously, it turned over. The engine coughed and sputtered, but it ran. I didn't hesitate, pulled back onto the road and accelerated away. In my mirror, I saw his truck start to follow. I pushed my car as hard as I dared on the winding road, the engine protesting but holding. The truck stayed behind me. Matching my speed, not closing the distance but not falling back either. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I prayed the engine wouldn't die again. It took 20 minutes of the most terrifying driving of my life before I saw the lights of hazard ahead. As soon as I entered town limits, the truck turned off onto a side road and disappeared. I drove straight to the police station, parked under the lights, sat shaking for several minutes before I could go inside. The officer on duty listened to my story. When I mentioned Blood Hollow Road, his expression changed. Recognition. He asked me to describe the man and the truck. Then he made a phone call. 20 minutes later, a detective arrived. Frank Morrison, State Police, 30 years on the job. He sat down across from me and told me something that made my blood run cold. Blood Hollow Road had a history, he said. Women had been disappearing from that stretch of highway for decades, not regularly enough to establish a clear pattern. Not in ways that drew much attention. A hitchhiker here, a stranded motorist there, spread out over 40 years. Most were never reported. Young women passing through who had no family looking for them. But there were 6 cases he knew about for certain. 6 women who'd last been seen on or near Blood Hollow Road between 1978 and 2015. Their bodies were never found. No witnesses, no evidence, nothing to investigate. Just women who'd vanished as completely as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. Frank had worked 2 of the cases himself. The lack of closure haunted him. He'd always suspected someone local was responsible. Someone who knew the area, who understood how isolated that road was, how perfect for hunting. But without bodies, without evidence, there was nothing he could do. I told him about the truck, about the man who'd followed me. Frank took notes, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. A general description of a common vehicle. A man who could be one of 100 people in these mountains. Not enough to pursue. Not enough to prove anything. But he warned me to stay off that road, especially at night. He gave me his card and told me to call if I ever saw that truck again. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd told me. I went to the library, searched through old newspapers on a microfilm. I found the articles about the missing women. Small stories buried in the back pages, and I found other things too. References to disappearances going back even further. To the 1950s and 60s. Women who'd simply vanished, their cars found abandoned on mountain roads. No sign of struggle. No clues. I talked to my grandmother about Blood Hollow Road, asked if she remembered anything strange. Her face grew dark at the question. She remembered, she said. Remembered her own mother warning her never to drive that road alone. Never to stop for anyone. The hollow had a reputation long before it even had a proper name. People disappeared there, Always had. The old folks said the land was cursed, that something hungry lived in those mountains. But my grandmother believed it wasn't something supernatural, it was something far worse. A person, or maybe a family, passing down their evil through generations. She told me about a girl she'd gone to school with who vanished on Blood Hollow Road in 1952. They found her car, but never found her. And her mother had told her about cases even older, stretching back to when the road was just a dirt track. I made the difficult decision to move my grandmother to a care facility in Lexington. I couldn't keep making that drive, couldn't keep risking that road. As I helped her pack, she gave me one final warning. There are places in these mountains where evil has put down roots so deep it becomes part of the land itself. Blood Hollow is one of those places. Stay away from it. Whatever lives there is still hungry, still hunting, and it's been feeding for a very long time. I left the mountains and never went back to Blood Hollow Road. The case remains unsolved. The disappearance is unexplained. Detective Morrison retired 3 years later, the missing women from Blood Hollow his greatest failure. And somewhere in those mountains, on that isolated stretch of highway where cell phones don't work and help is miles away, something is still waiting in the darkness for the next car to break down, the next victim to stop, the next person to make the fatal mistake of accepting help from a stranger on Blood Hollow Road. I was fresh out of college when I took the job with Appalachian Timber Resources. 22 years old, with a forestry degree and exactly 0 real-world experience. The pay was good, and I'd be spending my days outdoors in the mountains I'd loved my entire life. My supervisor was this old mountain man named Roy, who'd been surveying these forests for 40 years. First day on the job, he told me we'd be going places where cell phones didn't work and GPS signals got unreliable. The mountains have a way of hiding things, he said, and sometimes those things are better left hidden. It was late September when we went deep into the Nantahala National Forest, surveying a tract of old-growth timber. The area was so remote we had to hike in, carrying our equipment on our backs, following old logging roads that hadn't been used since the 70s. We'd been working for 3 days, camping near a creek, when Roy sent me ahead to scout and mark boundary trees. He gave me a handheld GPS and a radio, though he warned the radio probably wouldn't work once I got more than a mile away. Too many ridges. I'd been walking for maybe 2 hours when I noticed a trail. Faint, but definitely there, cutting through the undergrowth at an angle to my route. It wasn't on any of our maps, and it didn't look like a game trail. It was too straight, too deliberately cut. Curious, I followed it. The trail wound through dense laurel thicket, climbing steadily upward. After about 20 minutes, it opened into a small clearing, and in the center stood the remains of a logging camp. 3 cabins with partially collapsed roofs and walls leaning at dangerous angles. Other structures, too. Sheds, storage buildings, all in various stages of decay. I approached cautiously, my surveyor's instincts making me wary. The place had an oppressive feel to it, a heaviness in the air. I pulled out my camera and began documenting what I'd found. The first 2 cabins were mostly empty. Rusted tools, remains of furniture, old newspapers dated 1973, stuffed in cracks for insulation. The dates struck me as odd. This camp looked much older than the 70s. In the 3rd cabin, I found the hidden compartment. I'd been examining the floor when one board shifted under my weight. Underneath was a wooden box about the size of a large foot locker, sealed with a rusted padlock. I should have left it alone, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. I found a piece of metal pipe and broke the lock. Inside were things that made my blood run cold. Personal items. A woman's wallet with ID cards, the plastic yellowed and cracked. A man's wristwatch stopped at 2:15, reading glasses, a child's stuffed animal stained and deteriorating, and photographs, dozens of them, Polaroids showing people in what appeared to be this very camp. But these weren't happy camping photos. The people looked terrified, dirty, injured. Some were bound with rope. Some showed signs of violence that made my stomach turn. There were notebooks filled with handwriting I didn't want to read, maps with locations marked in red ink, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a partially decomposed plastic bag, pieces of jewelry, rings and necklaces, watches, too many pieces from too many different people. I stumbled out of the cabin and vomited into the weeds. I tried my radio. Nothing but static. My GPS was acting strangely too, the coordinates jumping around in ways that made no sense. I mocked my location as best I could, took as many photographs as my camera's memory would hold, and placed several items from the box into my pack as evidence. I knew I shouldn't move anything from a potential crime scene, but I also knew that without physical evidence, no one might believe what I'd found. The hike back to camp seemed to take forever. I kept looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling I was being watched. When I finally reached Roy, he was cooking dinner over the fire. I burst into the clearing breathless and pale and started talking so fast he had to tell me to slow down. Roy's expression grew darker as I told him what I'd found. He sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. He said there were stories about this part of the forest, rumors that had circulated among logging crews back in the 70s. Men who'd gone missing, hikers who'd vanished. But the authorities had never found anything. We hiked out the next morning, leaving our equipment behind. At the ranger station, I told my story to a skeptical park ranger who nevertheless agreed to send someone to investigate. It took 3 days to organize a proper response. When they finally returned to the site with a team that included sheriff's deputies and forensic specialists, they found the camp exactly as I described. The investigation that followed was massive. Forensic teams spent weeks at the site, carefully excavating and documenting everything. The items in the hidden box were traced back to missing persons cases dating from the late 60s through the mid-70s. 7 different people whose disappearances had never been solved. Ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbed earth at several locations. Excavations uncovered human remains, some in shallow graves, others in a collapsed root cellar. Forensic analysis confirmed what I'd feared. This place had been a prison, a nightmare hidden in the wilderness where someone had kept victims for days or weeks before killing them. The notebooks contained detailed records, descriptions of abductions, plans and preparations, observations about the victims. The writer never identified themselves. Referred to their activities with a clinical detachment that suggested either profound mental illness or complete lack of conscience. The investigation hit a dead end when it came to identifying the perpetrator. No fingerprints survived. The handwriting didn't match anyone in any database. The camp had been abandoned sometime in the mid-70s, and whoever operated it had simply vanished. Interviews with elderly locals turned up nothing useful, though several people recalled that loggers had avoided that particular hollow, claiming it felt wrong. The case officially remains unsolved. The known victims were finally identified, their families notified after decades of uncertainty. But the person who abducted them, who held them prisoner, who took their lives and buried them in the forest, they've never been found. They'd be in their 70s or 80s now, if they're even still alive. They might have moved on to other hunting grounds, other states, or they might have died years ago, taking their secrets to the grave. I never went back to timber surveying. I finished that season, but the work had lost its appeal. Every forest felt threatening now, every remote hollow a potential hiding place for horror. I transferred to an office job, working with satellite imagery and databases, never venturing into the deep woods again. But sometimes late at night, I find myself studying maps of the Appalachian Mountains. looking at all that empty space between the roads and towns and wondering what else is hidden out there in the darkness beneath the trees, waiting to be found. I'd been producing a podcast about unsolved crimes in Appalachia for about 3 years when I got the message. It was brief, almost cryptic. It mentioned a medical clinic that had operated in Pike County, Kentucky during the 90s, and it suggested I look into what happened to patients who'd visited there and then disappeared. I was intrigued. I'd covered numerous missing persons cases in the region. The isolation of these rural communities often meant crimes went unreported or were inadequately investigated. I began my research the usual way: newspaper archives, public records. What I found was surprisingly sparse. The clinic had been called Mountain View Medical Center, operating from 1991 to 1998 in a remote hollow about 15 miles outside Pikeville. It had been the only medical facility within a 40-mile radius, serving impoverished communities scattered throughout the mountains. The clinic had been run by a doctor named Harold Whitmore. According to his licensing records, he'd received his medical degree from a school in the Caribbean after failing to gain admission to American programs. He'd opened Mountain View shortly after moving to Kentucky, ostensibly to serve the underserved population. The clinic closed abruptly in 1998. Whitmore died in 2004 of natural causes, but the details were maddeningly elusive. No photographs of the clinic, no interviews with Whitmore, barely any mention of the facility beyond business filings and a few classified ads. It was as if someone had deliberately scrubbed the public record. I decided to travel to Pike County to investigate in person. I spent my first day at the county courthouse, reviewing property records and death certificates. The clinic had been located on land owned by a shell corporation that dissolved shortly after the facility closed. The building itself had burned down in 2001, officially ruled accidental, though the investigation notes were suspiciously thin. I began interviewing elderly locals. Most were reluctant to talk about Mountain View, changing the subject or claiming not to remember, but one woman agreed to speak with me, Dorothy Hayes, retired school teacher in her late 70s, sharp-minded and direct. She told me Mountain View had always felt wrong to the locals. Whitmore wasn't from the area, didn't understand mountain people, and there were rumors about his practice that made people uncomfortable. Patients would go in for routine procedures and then be transferred to larger hospitals for follow-up care, but some of those patients were never seen again. Their families would be told they'd been moved to facilities in other states, that records had been lost, that privacy laws prevented disclosure. Dorothy remembered specifically a young woman named Sarah Combs who'd gone to the clinic in 1995 for treatment of chronic pain. 24 years old, mother of 2, struggling with back injuries from a car accident. After her third visit to Mountain View, she was transferred, according to Whitmore, to a pain management facility in Tennessee. Her family never saw her again. They reported her missing, but the investigation went nowhere. No records of her at any facility in Tennessee. It was as if she'd simply vanished. Dorothy knew of at least 4 other similar cases. People who went to Mountain View and then disappeared after being transferred to facilities that had no record of them. All were young, relatively healthy despite their complaints, and all came from poor families who lacked resources to push back. Dorothy suggested I talk to a local man named Curtis Mills, who'd done some work at the clinic in the mid-90s. Finding Curtis took 3 days. He lived in a trailer deep in a hollow, accessible only by a rutted dirt road. He was in his 60s, weathered and suspicious, but the promise of payment convinced him to talk. Curtis had worked as a handyman at Mountain View, fixing plumbing, doing odd repairs. He'd never liked Dr. Whitmore. Said there was something cold about the man, something calculating. Curtis told me about discovering a locked room in the basement that wasn't on the building plans. When he asked Whitmore about it, The doctor became angry, told him to mind his own business, that it was storage for sensitive equipment. But Curtis had heard things. Late at night when he was working after hours, he'd hear sounds from that locked room. People crying, people calling for help. Once he'd seen Whitmore and another man wheeling someone on a gurney out to a van in the middle of the night. The person on the gurney was covered with a sheet, but was clearly alive, moving beneath the fabric. Curtis said he tried to report what he saw to the county sheriff, but he was dismissed as a drug addict making up stories. His methamphetamine use was well known. No one took him seriously. He stopped working at the clinic shortly after. Too disturbed to continue, Curtis agreed to show me where the clinic had been. The site was overgrown, nature reclaiming the land, but the foundation was still visible, concrete blocks marking where the building had stood. I walked the perimeter, photographing everything. I noticed something odd. The dimensions didn't match the official building plans. The actual footprint was larger than what had been permitted, suggesting unpermitted construction, possibly that locked basement room Curtis had mentioned. I spent the next 2 weeks digging deeper. I obtained death certificates for people who died in Pike County during the 90s, looking for patterns. I found them. 7 people who'd been patients at Mountain View and who died within months of their last visit. All with causes of death listed vaguely as organ failure or complications from pre-existing conditions. But when I tracked down their families, several insisted their loved ones had been healthy before visiting the clinic, had gone in for minor issues and come out dying. I also discovered something in state medical licensing records. Harold Whitmore had been investigated twice before opening Mountain View. Once for performing unnecessary surgeries in Florida. Once for falsifying patient records in Nevada. Both investigations were dropped due to technicalities, but the pattern suggested a doctor willing to cross ethical lines. I compiled everything into an episode and submitted my findings to the Kentucky State Police. The case was reopened. Detectives interviewed families, reviewed surviving medical records, brought in forensic accountants to examine the clinic's finances. What they uncovered suggested Whitmore had been running an illegal organ harvesting operation. Patients who came in with minor complaints were identified as potential donors, sedated or coerced, their organs removed for sale on the black market. Some victims survived and were dumped at distant hospitals with fabricated paperwork. Others died and were disposed of in ways that remain unknown. Investigators believed at least 12 people had been victimized, possibly many more. The investigation revealed Whitmore hadn't been working alone. There was evidence of a network, other individuals involved in transportation and sale of organs. But most of the key players were dead or had disappeared. The clinic's destruction by fire in 2001 now appeared deliberate. An attempt to destroy evidence. Soil samples from the site revealed traces of human blood in concentrations that suggested the location had been used to dispose of biological waste, possibly including bodies. My investigation brought some measure of closure to families, confirmation that their suspicions had been valid, but it also opened wounds, forced them to confront the horrific reality of what had happened. The case remains officially unsolved in terms of prosecutions. Whitmore is dead. His accomplices never conclusively identified. The bodies never found. Though searches continue. I produced a follow-up episode detailing the findings, and it became one of my most downloaded, sparking renewed interest in other suspicious medical facilities that operated in remote areas during the same period. I discovered through research that Mountain View wasn't unique. There were other clinics in other isolated communities throughout Appalachia with similar patterns. The combination of poverty, isolation, and lack of oversight created environments where predators could operate with impunity, where the vulnerable could be victimized, and no one with power would notice or care. I continue to investigate these cases, driven by a need to give voice to victims who were silenced. to shine light into the darkest corners of the region I love. The Mountain View case taught me that sometimes the most horrific crimes happen not in back alleys or abandoned buildings, but in places we're taught to trust, carried out by people wearing white coats and claiming to help. And in the mountains, where help is scarce and desperation runs deep, those predators found hunting grounds where they could feed for years before anyone thought to question where the missing had gone. This happened back in 2019, and it still gives me chills. I was at Marshall University, junior year, studying history and photography with two friends, Marcus and Tyler. We were into urban exploration, loved documenting the abandoned coal camps scattered throughout southern West Virginia. These ghost towns offered glimpses into a vanished world. Company towns left to rot when the mines closed and people moved away. We'd spent months researching locations, studying old maps and mining company records, identifying camps that were both accessible and relatively safe. The camp we chose was called Blackwood, located deep in a hollow about 40 miles south of Charleston. It had been a thriving community in the 30s and 40s, housing over 300 miners and their families. The mine closed in 1954 after a catastrophic collapse that killed 18 men. The company just walked away, left the buildings to decay. By 1960, Blackwood was completely abandoned. We drove as far as we could on what remained of the access road, then hiked the final 3 miles. The terrain was rough. The old road washed out in places. We reached Blackwood in an early afternoon. Dozens of structures remained standing, though most were in advanced stages of collapse. Company houses, a general store, a school building, even a small church with its steeple still intact. The three of us split up to explore, agreed to meet back at the entrance in 2 hours. I headed toward the mine superintendent's house, a larger structure on a small rise overlooking the rest of the camp. The building was in better condition than most. Roof mostly intact. Walls still square. I climbed carefully onto the porch and pushed open the front door. The interior was dark, smelled of rot and animal droppings, but surprisingly, there were intact furnishings, as if the superintendent had left intending to return. A couch and chairs in the front room, a dining table still set with plates. Upstairs, I found bedrooms with clothes still hanging in closets. It was eerie how much had been left behind. I was photographing a child's room, toys scattered across the floor, when I heard sounds from downstairs, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the first floor. I assumed Marcus or Tyler had decided to check out this building. I called out, asking which one it was. No response. The footsteps continued, moving from room to room. I called out again, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in. I made my way to the stairs and descended carefully, flashlight cutting through darkness. The first floor was empty, no sign of anyone. I checked each room thoroughly. I was alone in the house. I stepped back outside, shaking off the uneasy feeling, and continued exploring. I spent the next hour photographing other buildings. The general store with shelves still stocked with rusted cans. The school with desks still in rows. It was in one of the smaller houses at the far end of camp that I found the first sign something was seriously wrong. The house appeared to have been used recently. There was a sleeping bag on the floor, relatively new, not covered in dust like everything else. Empty food wrappers, water bottles, a camping stove. Someone had been living here, or at least staying here regularly. My heart rate increased. We weren't alone in this abandoned camp. I quickly left and headed back towards the meeting point, wanting to warn Marcus and Tyler. As I walked through the center of camp, I began noticing other signs of habitation. A tarp stretched between buildings, creating shelter, footprints in the dirt. Fresh and recent. and something that made my blood run cold. Clothing hanging from a line stretched between two trees. Women's clothing in various sizes, all relatively new. Far more clothing than one person would need, and the variety suggested it came from multiple sources. I broke into a run, shouting for my friends. I found Tyler first. He'd been exploring the church and had also noticed signs someone was using the camp. We found Marcus near the old company store, taking photographs. I quickly explained what I'd found. We agreed we needed to leave immediately. This wasn't some homeless person. This felt organized, deliberate, and the women's clothing was deeply disturbing. We hurried back toward where we'd entered, moving as quickly as the rough terrain allowed. We were about halfway there when we saw him. A man emerged from one of the buildings, watching us, tall and thin, dirty jeans and flannel shirt, beard that looked months old. He didn't say anything, just stood there, blocking the path. I made a decision. We'd go around, take a different route out, even if it meant bushwhacking through forest. We turned and headed in a different direction. Within minutes, we saw another man, shorter and heavier, also watching silently. It became clear quickly that we were being herded, prevented from leaving by multiple people who knew the terrain better than we did. Tyler suggested we make a stand, that the three of us could fight our way past, but I saw at least 2 more men emerging from buildings, moving to surround us. We were outnumbered, in unfamiliar territory. I made the only decision that seemed survivable. We ran, crashed through the forest, not following any trail, just trying to put distance between ourselves and the camp. Behind us, we could hear pursuit, men crashing through undergrowth. I led them uphill, remembering from our maps that there was a ridgeline that would provide orientation. Marcus fell behind, his shorter legs struggling with the steep terrain. Tyler and I slowed to help him, but the sounds of pursuit were getting closer. We reached a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. That's when Marcus screamed. He dropped back just a few yards, but in the thick forest we couldn't see him. Tyler turned to go back, but I grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. We couldn't help Marcus if we were caught too. We kept running, guilt and terror driving us onward. We reached the ridgeline as the sun was setting, finally able to orient ourselves. We moved along the ridge, staying off trails. Using the GPS on my phone to navigate toward the nearest road. It took until after midnight to reach a paved highway. We flagged down a truck and were taken to the nearest town. The sheriff's department responded. A major search and rescue operation launched at dawn. Tyler and I led them back to the camp, a heavily armed team of deputies and state troopers. What they found was disturbing. The camp showed clear evidence of multiple people living there. Structures that had been reinforced and weatherproofed, and in one building they found what appeared to be a drug manufacturing operation. Tables covered with equipment and chemicals, evidence of a methamphetamine lab. They also found evidence of violence, blood stains in several buildings, items of clothing with obvious damage. And in the old mine entrance, which had been partially reopened, they found human remains. 3 bodies. 2 women and 1 man, in various states of decomposition. They were never identified, had no ID, didn't match any missing persons reports. Marcus's body was found later that day, about a quarter mile from where I'd last seen him. He'd been struck on the head with a blunt object. The medical examiner said he died within an hour of being attacked, probably while Tyler and I were still running through the forest. The investigation revealed the abandoned camp had been used for years as a base for criminal activity, drug manufacturing, possibly human trafficking given the women's clothing and the bodies found in the mine. The authorities believed at least 5 men had been operating out of Blackwood, but they'd all fled when police arrived. Searches turned up no suspects. Several arrests were eventually made based on evidence collected, but the main operators were never caught. The case remains open. Marcus's murder unsolved. multiple suspects still at large. I left Marshall at the end of that semester, unable to continue after what happened. The guilt of leaving Marcus behind, even though rationally I knew there had been no choice, ate at me. I moved to Ohio, changed my major. Tried to rebuild. I never went urban exploring again, never ventured into abandoned places or remote areas. Tyler has his own struggles, completed his degree but suffers from severe anxiety and PTSD. The two of us rarely speak, the shared trauma too painful to revisit. When we do talk, it's never about Blackwood, never about that day in the forest when we ran and Marcus died. The abandoned coal camps of Appalachia remain, dozens of them scattered through the mountains, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Some have become tourist attractions, preserved as historical sites, but others remain isolated and forgotten, hidden in hollows where roads no longer reach. Places where darkness has found a home and uses the ruins as camouflage for activities that wouldn't survive exposure to light. I know Blackwood wasn't unique. That there are other places like it throughout the region, other abandoned settlements where predators have found sanctuary and victims have disappeared without anyone noticing or caring. And I know Marcus is just one name in a long list of people who went into the Appalachian wilderness and never came back. Some say the mountains remember everything, every person who walked into the darkness, every secret buried beneath the trees. But I think the mountains don't care. They just sit there, ancient and patient, watching as we stumble through their hollows, watching as we discover what's been hidden. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the ridges and valleys, you can almost hear them, all the voices of people who never made it home. Thanks for listening. If you made it through the darkness. I'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the places where the light doesn't reach.